This is dangerous and distressing. A lying, deflated Donald Trump has falsely claimed victory from the White House podium. He's baselessly made accusations of fraud without any evidence whatsoever. This is not normal. We cannot allow it to become normal. If it was happening in any other country, Australia would be out condemning it. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, must condemn Donald Trump's false claims of voter fraud and claims of victory. What Donald Trump is doing and saying is designed to get a reaction from his supporters on the ground, a potentially violent reaction. It is very dangerous. It is a threat to democracy, and Australia must unequivocally condemn it.
Do you think his claims of voter fraud need to be explored, though?
Well, there's no evidence for it, absolutely no evidence. And there's a reason that networks in the United States cut away from the president making these claims. It's because there is zero evidence. He's got the capacity, if he wants to challenge any results, just as people in other countries would have the capacity to challenge any results. But so far, aside from frivolous lawsuits, there's been no evidence put forward whatsoever, and that is widely agreed across the spectrum. So he can't put forward any evidence of fraud. The best that he can say is that as every vote is counted, he is falling behind in some states, which stands to reason. He suggests wild conspiracy about opinion polls being out there against him. This is all designed to hold on to the presidency by force and to deny the democratic will. And he's revving up potentially violent reactions amongst his supporters. And yes, he's absolutely right that the US networks then refused to broadcast that kind of incitement. And it's time for Australia to step up and defend democracy. It is time to distance ourselves from Donald Trump's wild and false claims.
The polls were not correct, though. They predicted, or most of them predicted, that Biden would win by a landslide. That's certainly not the case. So does he have a point that it's a suppression tactic?
Well, if the polls get things slightly wrong, that's not a suggestion that somehow there's been electoral fraud involved. That's a question about the polling, not about how people have voted. But I think what you're going to see is, as some of these, the final votes are counted, that a lot of those states that at the moment are being close may well not end up being close races, and we may well find that off the back of a strong campaign around climate action, where he pulled climate change an existential threat and where he put in place targets in the 2030s, we may find Joe Biden pulling even further ahead. In fact, had it been the other way around, where the early votes were counted first rather than afterwards, everyone would be talking now potentially about Joe Biden moving towards a comfortable victory. So the early votes that are now being counted late are breaking the way that people had expected they would. Donald Trump doesn't like it, but that's democracy.
Just on another issue now, Chinese media is reporting confirmation of further bans on Australian imported goods worth more than $6 billion a year. Tensions certainly seem to be escalating. Do you think the government is doing enough on this ongoing trade war?
Well, a couple of things. This becoming clear from these decisions. One is that Australia is not sufficiently self-reliant. We have become too reliant on China over the years. We do not have a good enough manufacturing capacity here ourselves, and the COVID pandemic laid that bare. And that's as a result of free trade agreements that Liberal and Labor have been signing with countries over many years that trade away our basic capacity, our domestic capacity, our economic capacity, our manufacturing capacity here. So we've been shown to be insufficiently, or to be too reliant on other countries, and we haven't diversified our economy enough. Secondly, it's clear that we've been dragged into, and Scott Morrison proposed to do this, to be dragged into Donald Trump's domestic re-election politics by siding with Trump in Trump's ongoing trade wars and the like with China. And that was not an independent decision that was being made in Australia's interest. It was a decision that was being made because of US domestic re-election politics, and that was an error. And thirdly, what's becoming clear, especially with the bans on coal, and South Korea now and Japan both moving to net zero targets, is that the future for coal exports in Australia is very limited. And Joe Biden is talking about potential tariffs being imposed on countries that don't have climate policies. We're seeing a collapse over the next 10 or 20 years in Australia's thermal coal export market. And again, the government has been left flat-footed on this as well. Scott Morrison is increasingly isolated on climate, and we've got to come up with a plan to deal with the fact that China, Japan, South Korea have told us now that they may not be buying our thermal coal for much longer, and we need a plan to look after those workers in coal communities.
Yeah. I want to ask you about South Korea in just a second, but we've got live pictures coming through from Washington, D.C. It looks like a protest. From what I can see, it looks quite peaceful, but we will keep our eyes on that and go back to it. You urged South Korea to stop buying Australian coal and include carbon tariffs against us. Are you standing by those comments?
Yes. South Korea has said that they are going to net zero emissions by the middle of the century. Now, South Korea, as one of the three largest thermal coal customers, has basically said that they are getting out of Australian thermal coal. Now, the federal government does not seem to get the message. We've got our three largest customers saying we don't want Australian thermal coal anymore. And the federal government doesn't get the message, so it needs to get the message. And if
the Nationals have asked you to retract those comments saying that this is an attempt to undermine our democracy. Do you see the Nats' point there? A lot of jobs rely on the coal industry.
Coal is a threat to Australia, and the Nationals are a threat to Australian farmers and workers and our environment. The biggest threat that Australian farmers face at the moment is a government that doesn't care about acting on the climate crisis. Coal will make the climate crisis worse, and it will mean, on the reports that and predictions that have been forecast for Australia, that according to the Bureau of Meteorology, Australia is going to warm by 4.4 degrees by the end of this century. That means a decline in over 90% in the Murray-Darling Basin. The government has to choose between crops or coal. You can't have both. And at the moment, Michael McCormack and the federal government are choosing coal over crops. The biggest threat to Australian farmers and Australian jobs at the moment is Michael McCormack and Scott Morrison and their coal hugging. Now, other countries have understood and accepted the climate science, and if Australian government doesn't get it, then I hope that those other countries, when they negotiate trade agreements with Australia, start saying to Australia, we're going to start putting a price on your dirty products, and we're going to encourage you instead to sell us green hydrogen and green steel. That should be our export markets of the future.